Good morning, Travel Jazzman Scholar. I had the good fortune to work in northern Mexico in a squatter settlement on and off for 3 or 4 years, and I also was able to study at UCLA in the public health school, a field called medical anthropology, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what that means. For many years, the very benevolent and altruistic intentions of the more wealthy and more educated societies has been to help the more impoverished and less educated societies and countries, what has been often called the third world, by various forms of development aid and support. And in many instances, that has been counterproductive. And medical anthropology emerged as a field in which anthropologists who understood the power of cultural beliefs intervened in these medical programs and these health education efforts to better respond to what local people felt and thought to begin with. So to give one example, there was a woman in the 1970s who raised a good amount of money. She had been living in Peru, and she had noticed that the cattle farming was contaminating the water that flowed into many tribal villages in the high Andes. It was contaminating them with E. coli bacteria, and so people were developing a lot of intestinal parasitic dysentery, and the young children were often getting sick and dying of dehydration. So she was trying to intervene, and so she raised money to do a campaign to teach people to boil water before they drank it. So she spent several months traveling through a number of Andean villages teaching the women, who were the ones who handled the cooking, teaching them to boil water and explaining to them that it killed parasites and doing a whole educational program around that. And the people were very responsive, and they smiled and they listened and they agreed and they nodded, and the woman came back about 8 months later as a follow-up to see whether or not she had been successful and to evaluate the program as part of her grant. And she realized nobody was boiling water, and they were still getting parasites. And so she began to do interviews and ask people, why aren't you boiling water? And they said, well, you can't boil water. Water has the spirit of the earth in it. It's one of the critical, powerful spirits that we bring into our bodies, and when you boil it, you destroy the spirit. So we must drink the water as it comes out of the earth. Of course, you know that, right? I mean, it was sort of the response to the anthropologist once she asked them the question was, well, obviously anyone knows that. So this was a case where an effort failed completely because it didn't take that into consideration. Another effort in Ecuador, where women were given intrauterine devices, IUDs, to help with family planning, to reduce the high incidence of the high birth rate in villages where there weren't a lot of resources. So women who wanted to reduce their incidence of pregnancy, to stop having so many children, were given the option of having an IUD implanted in the uterus. And what they didn't take into account, the people who ran this program, was that women, when they were menstruating, weren't able to handle food. That was one of the conditions of these particular tribal groups. They had a belief system around, they did menstrual seclusion. Well, the IUD increased the length and severity of menstrual bleeding, so women ended up being secluded for longer periods of time. Kids were going without adequate care and food and supervision for longer periods of time. It actually negatively impacted the health of the village. Another case in point. So I read about an account where an anthropologist who had been living in Guatemala had used up all of this grant money as part of their research on, they were studying indigenous shamanism. But as they left the village, they had about $2,700 left over, so they called together a count. He said, the anthropologist said, I'd like to give this money to the village, understanding that maybe the villagers would know how best to use this very large sum of money for them. And the women and men got together, and they had a long conversation, and they came to the anthropologist, and they said, yes, we know what we would like to do with the $2,700. We would like to put lights and a generator around our dirt soccer field so that the men can play soccer at night. And the anthropologist was like, I'm not going to question that. So the money was given, and the lights were put up, and the impact on the village was significant in the following ways. The men loved soccer, so they were eager to play soccer. Now, these men were itinerant farmers. They worked in the local haciendas that surrounded this village area, and they worked in these fields, and it was a very impoverished area. And they would come back from work early in the afternoon to play soccer, because they loved to play soccer, and then in the evenings they would drink. and there was a high incidence of alcoholism. Well, the men were very enticed with the idea of having these lights on the soccer field. The women, however, really understood the implications of this because they knew that the men would work longer hours, make more money for the family. Then they would come home, have their dinner, and go play soccer until they fell asleep, and they wouldn't be drinking. So it actually reduced the incidence of alcoholism, the repercussions of alcohol abuse, and it increased the resource base of the village because the men were working longer hours and making more money and getting up earlier and going to work earlier because they weren't hungover. So it had a profound positive social impact on the community to put soccer lights in, whereas an outsider in a development mentality might not have any clue that that would be beneficial. I had an experience where I was working in a squatter settlement and there was no running water, and I wanted to do something for the family I'd been living with. And I remembered that they talked about what it would be like to have a shower. I don't remember how the conversation came up, but they had no running water. They had a bucket, a big, huge 150-gallon plastic container, like an oil drum type container that would get filled every couple of days by a truck that came by, and that was their water source. So I got one of those big oil drum type plastic containers. It actually had olives in it. It was, I don't know where they acquired these, but they would buy them at this local distributor in Mexicali. But I built out of 2x4s a platform about 6 feet high, and I put in all the plumbing, and I made a little pump to fill it with water, and this was going to be their shower. I was so excited, and I built it for them. I was a carpenter, and they were very, very grateful, very, very grateful. Well, I never asked them if that's what they wanted, and they were living in a really, really modest home that had some cardboard walls, that had some different kinds of plywood, and it was very tacked together. And I built this shower with beautiful pieces of 2x4 that I bought, and it ended up they needed that wood for other things. And so I came back a couple months later, and the whole thing was disassembled, and the wood was being put to other uses that probably were much more important to their family. But here was a case where I thought I knew what they needed, and I did what I thought would be best for them, and it wasn't what they needed. So it was a lesson for me. In spite of what I had already learned about medical anthropology, I already had my master's degree in Latin American studies. I shouldn't have known that my intervention was completely inappropriate, however heartfelt. But anyway, the field of medical anthropology is one instance in which the academic scholarly world is actually attempting to break away from this sort of paternalistic, somewhat condescending approach that elite, educated, wealthier people tend to have with those who have fewer resources. And it's nice to see academic circles changing. It's another indication of the great turning that we are in. And with that, Tribal Jazzman Scholar will sign off. Thanks for joining me.